I want to go to Misty Marris now, one of our key legal analysts who has followed this case since the very beginning. Misty, a lot of numbers being thrown around in court right now, but break it down for us. What exactly is the judge weighing here? He has a lot of discretion. He has the sentencing guidelines, which of course are a starting point. But walk our viewers through exactly what he's going to be weighing. As of right now, he's on the bench and he's talking in some detail about listening to the victim's testimony.
Absolutely, Laura, and so much information coming out in court today, much of which was laid out in the prosecution's brief, what they think an appropriate sentence would be, looking for 11 years, versus the defendant's sentencing brief, 14 months, which would essentially mean he goes free. The judge also taking into consideration the probation department's recommendation, which is somewhere in the range of 5.5 to 7.5 years. So all of that is being taken into consideration. But important to note, what does federal sentencing look like? Well, first, the judge goes through this analysis. Where does this fall when it comes to the federal sentencing guidelines? And that's where you look at certain types of offenses, criminal history, whether or not there are aggravating factors taken into consideration, and then the defendant will get a score. So, Laura, that's what we heard in court in the beginning of the day when the judge was laying out what he was going to be taking into consideration. And he said he doesn't believe there's a reason to go outside the sentencing guidelines, which is that range that the probation department said, somewhere in the range of 5 to 7 years. Now, the second part, Laura, this is the key. It's an individualized assessment of the individual. And that's what we've been hearing as the day unfolds. He's taking into consideration whether or not the defendant shows remorse, is taking accountability, rehabilitation, and another big one, deterrence. Not just deterrence of Combs to engage in this type of behavior, but what does it say to others, and sending a message that this type of conduct will not be tolerated and it will be punished. So all of that is going to be central to the judge's determination. And as I'm watching the judge's words, followed by the reporters in court, he is focusing on Combs being somebody who was a successful entrepreneur, self-made, absolutely loves his family, has contributed to society, but he cannot ignore the nature and offense of the crime. And we heard prosecutors lay out a couple of things. 15 years of conduct, 172 freak-offs, knew it was wrong and did it anyway. So these are all of the factors the judge is going to be weighing in making that final decision. So even though he said this is the range I'm looking at, it could vary based on those factors, specifically rehabilitation, accountability, deterrence, and whether or not this is something that Combs is actually remorseful for. So it's a lot of latitude for the judge to make this decision.
And Missy, some of the language here is pretty striking. It's federal court, so obviously we can't bring it inside the courtroom, but thankfully we have a bunch of producers there who are able to give us notes and give us color of what's happening. And some of the language from the judge here is really strong, Misty, and it almost sounds like some of the language we heard earlier from the prosecution, which suggested that Combs and his attorneys had minimized some of the violence. And this is from the judge saying, I was sitting right here for Cassie and Jane's testimony, referring to the two survivors. We read about it. We saw the gashes, the bruises, the broken down doors, the video of your savage beating of Miss Ventura, probably the most damning piece of evidence in this case. One of the videos was played there for the jury. We all saw it with our own eyes when it became public. And the judge also explaining here that you plied Cassie Ventura with drugs. She had an addiction over a decade. That goes to this issue that the defense has raised, that, look, she wasn't, she was there willingly for some of these instances. She was actually a participant here. And it appears the judge is pushing back on some of that pretty hard here, Misty.
Yes, Laura. So that is a key legal argument that the defense raised, whether or not Cassie Ventura and Jane were participants or victims. The judge had said he views them as vulnerable victims, which means that's an aggravating factor, something that can increase the sentence. And Laura, what strikes me, and I'm watching the notes from the reporters as well, he said he rejects the narrative that this is just a case of sex, drugs, and rock and roll between consensual, intimate partners. He's looking looking at this very differently. And something that cannot be lost, the judge sits through the whole case. It is the same judge who will make the sentencing determination, who heard all of the evidence and all of the testimony throughout the trial. So it's very clear that the judge is not buying some of what the defense was setting forth with their narrative and is focused on some of the factors that the prosecutors laid out, the violence, the drug use. And those are all what we call in federal practice relevant factors, and federal judges can take them into consideration. This is over of course, the defense objects, says that he was acquitted on certain charges, but you see there's a reason why the judge is laying out the rationale here and focusing on a lot of the violence, and as you said, Laura, in great detail, because this will be something the defense will be looking at it for a potential appeal. So we are going to see exactly what the judge is focused on and how it fits into those categories to justify the sentence that's imposed.
Yeah, and Missy, it's worth noting here, because I think some people might be looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, he was acquitted of the charges that could have kept him behind bars for years, actually for the rest of his life. The government's asking for way more time than the defense, but the judge is saying, I can consider relevant conduct. Can you just explain what that means in this context when he was acquitted of the things that would have required violence, would have required coercion, would have required force?
Yes, absolutely, Laura. So there are two buckets here that the court will look at, and the rules actually changed as far as sentencing. And there's a new regulation. When I say new, I'm talking 2024. The regulation says that in sentencing, judges cannot consider acquitted conduct, meaning any conduct that relates to charges where a defendant was found not guilty. But they are permitted to consider relevant conduct. And when you have a case where some of the charges were resulted in an acquittal and some resulted in a conviction, there is oftentimes an overlap as far as what evidence relates to the charges where there was a conviction, in this case the Mann Act, versus the others. And that line is quite blurry, Laura. So the judge has a lot of discretion to take anything and everything that came out in the trial into consideration. And here what you're seeing is really relating to what the prosecution's argument was, that you can't ignore the way these crimes were committed. We have evidence, we have a video. You can see on the video that was during a freak-off, during an act of prostitution, and therefore the violence and drug use, which was conceded by the defense, is relevant conduct. The defense obviously having an alternate view, but in federal sentencing, there is a wide net of evidence that can be considered in making a sentence harsher or better, depending on the circumstances. So here, that relevant conduct bucket, we are seeing, as we're reading what the judge is saying, it is very clear that the violence, the drug use, the time frame over which this happened, 15 years, it's all something that he is considering when making this sentencing decision.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the judge explaining, of course, his factors as he's required to do under the law, required to explain his justification, even though he has wide latitude here and an enormous amount of discretion, and explaining that he doesn't agree with the prosecution and he actually doesn't agree with the defense either here, Misty, saying that the defense doesn't take into account his criminal history, or lack of criminal history, but the defense doesn't actually account for his aggravating factors, meaning the violence, the drugs. Remember, in court we heard today the defense sort of really pushing this idea he wasn't a pimp, right? He wasn't making money off of prostituting women, and it appears to be that's one of the arguments that has really backfired with this judge as he's weighing all the factors. The judge also saying that a sentence over 11 years is not reasonable. That's what, of course, the prosecution had argued for. The prosecution trying to take in all of the aggravating factors that it possibly can, right? The prosecution really sort of went all in a way that we weren't necessarily expecting, Misty. We weren't sure whether they would be asking for the max with 20. We weren't sure exactly how far they would go. And instead, the judge now saying, weighing all the relevant factors, he has said a sentence of 50 months. Here, Misty, he's saying that this is a hard time in prison. He recognizes that he will have a life afterwards. This matches the probation department, which is an interesting weighing of all the different factors here, Misty. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think the prosecutors, when they, in their brief and really scrutinizing the brief, I noticed that all of the evidence that came out in the trial, they were putting into this bucket of relevant conduct as opposed to acquitted conduct instead of parsing through it. So they were really taking everything and saying the judge should consider anything and everything that came out, including force, fraud, and coercion, including obstruction of justice, including all of the things that underlie the RICO and racketeering case that was ultimately resulted in an acquittal. And I think, Laura, it was a bit heavy-handed. And that's where we see the judge saying this is not a case that's going to have what's called an upward departure from the sentencing guidelines. Now, on the flip side, the judge has made it clear that he was not on board with the defense minimizing some of the conduct. He even said that, we're hearing that these were basically consensual sexual encounters, and I'm not buying that. I'm looking at the testimony. I'm seeing that there was some degree of coercion in these relationships and that these were vulnerable victims. And Laura, you hit on another central point. Whether or not Combs is a John, meaning somebody who solicits the services of prostitutes, or a pimp, whether he is somebody who stands in that position of control. And all of those factors were things that the court takes into consideration. I think this is a sentence that falls very squarely within the sentencing guidelines. It really makes the sentence pretty bulletproof when it comes to an appeal because of that. And I'm not surprised to see the judge following in the footsteps of the probation department, who does a deep dive on all of these factors and makes their assessment. I think in this case, the judge is pretty squarely within what would be a reasonable sentence under the law.
And just to reset for our viewers here, Misty, the federal judge there in the Southern District of New York has just sentenced Sean Diddy Combs to 50 months in prison, 4 years, and a little bit over 4 years in prison for those two counts, those two prostitution-related counts. Of course, this is a blow to Sean Diddy Combs, who had been asking for just 14 months in prison. It's also not what the prosecutors had asked for, which had been far greater, 11 years in prison, and he has received 4 years in prison. Now, the judge still on the bench talking about where he will be housed.